Hey kids, it's now time for the Civil War, Part 2. Last week we covered kind of the basics of the two sides, Lincoln and Jefferson Davis for the Confederacy. We talked about the border states. We talked about the Anaconda Plan and how the South just wanted to hold on and hope that the North or the Union would grow tired of fighting. This week we're going to actually talk about some of the battles. You don't have to know every single battle, of course. You're only in 8th grade for a couple more weeks. And we don't expect you to know everything, but there's a few key battles that are kind of important. And there'll be some names and things that I'll have on some of the notes and slides that you won't have to know, but I just want to get you to think. So as you get into the high school classes and beyond, you'll kind of have some ground to be standing on, kind of be thinking about a basis of understanding for some of this. So remember, the Civil War is from 1861 to 1865, and everyone who died is an American. So this war had the most Americans die of any war. So once we have Fort Sumter, there's not really any casualties of that, but that's the first shots of the war. The first real significant battle of the war is a place called Bull Run. First Bull Run is the name of the battle. That means there's probably a second one, but we don't have to know anything about the second battle of Bull Run. The first one, I would say, is probably more significant. Now, what you should know about the Civil War is that the Union tended to name the battles after a stream or a river or a geographic feature such as a hill, whereas the Confederacy tended to name the battles after the nearest city. So Bull Run was an actual stream, and Manassas was the city. So if I were teaching this class in Alabama, we might say the Battle of Manassas. But since we're in Ohio, we usually go by the Union name of Bull Run. July 21st, 1861. You'll see on the screen there's several generals mentioned. I just want to show you that for each side, there's usually more than one general, but one guy in charge. So General Irwin McDowell was the Union general, the head general. He had other lesser generals helping him, but he was the main one. General Pierre Beauregard was the Confederate general, but he had other generals helping him, like probably the most famous general of this battle, Stonewall Jackson. He is pictured in the upper right. And we do have photography by the time we get to the Civil War, so these are actual photos of the generals and soldiers and things. That battlefield picture on the bottom right is an actual photo of Bull Run. This is right outside Washington, D.C., in Virginia. And what makes this interesting is that people in Washington wanted to come out and watch this battle because they were bored. They had nothing to do, and they thought this would be a fun thing to do and have a picnic and watch the battle. And once the fighting starts, everyone who'd come out, it was just overwhelmed by the carnage and the death and the craziness of it. And people just try to get out of there as fast as they can. And a lot of folks get injured in carriage accidents just getting away from the battle. It's extremely bloody, and in the end, the Confederacy actually wins the first battle. Even though the Union looks like they're so superior on paper, once in a while, the Confederacy will fight so hard that they will win. The Union is surprised by how hard they fight, and the Confederacy wins this first battle. So it looks like they are off to show the Union is how tough they are. If you also look at this slide, you can see the Virginia state flag. That's where Bull Run is at, or Manassas, Virginia. Let's zoom in on that. That's still the Virginia state flag today. It's the only flag on planet Earth with a murder scene on it. So you see the guy in the light blue. He's got a bit of a slight dress code violation. He had just killed the tyrant, or the evil king, and he's standing over his body. The Virginia motto is Sic Semper Tyrannis, which is translated, thus always to tyrants, meaning this is what happens to bad, evil kings. Just so you know, when John Wilkes Booth shoots Lincoln, he will scream out the Virginia motto, Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, meaning Lincoln was a tyrant or a wicked king and needed to go. So now you know. We talked about the Anaconda Plan last week. It's a little hard to have the Anaconda Plan when you're not actually winning. The Union lost at Bull Run, and so Lincoln is itching for a victory. He wants a victory, and he's willing to sacrifice lots of men to try to fight and defeat the Confederates at a big battle and get a decisive victory. That would come in the form of a battle known as Antietam. Now, Antietam is a single day battle, and it is the bloodiest day, single day, in American history, meaning more people die on this day than any other one single day in American history. Antietam is also known as Sharpsburg, Maryland. So Antietam Creek, Sharpsburg, Maryland. The general for the Confederacy is Robert E. Lee. I'm sure you've heard of him. And for the Union would be a man named George McClellan. This is September 17th, 1862. It's a seriously bloody and terrible battle. And in the end, the Union actually wins. So when the Union wins this victory at Antietam, Lincoln is ready now to do something that he's been wanting to do since the war started. Since the war started, he's been saying we want to fight to save the Union. Now he's going to say we want to fight this war to save the Union and to begin to end slavery. But he knows that he can't just say no slavery. Well, for one, it's unconstitutional, right? This Constitution says there shall be slavery. And he knows if he says anything like that, states like Maryland, which was a border state, remember those 5 border states? Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, and Missouri? They would leave. They would leave the Union if Lincoln tries to end slavery in those states. And Lincoln did not want to make Maryland upset because obviously if they left, the national capital of the United States would be surrounded by the Confederacy, Maryland and Virginia. So what he does is he says he can begin to this process of ending slavery by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. That's what EP stands for on this slide. The Emancipation Proclamation, meaning he's proclaiming that some people would be emancipated or free. The Emancipation Proclamation does not free slaves everywhere. A lot of people think that today. But what it did was, it said in a time of war and craziness that the president has some powers over those states that are rebelling. So those states that are rebelling, those 11 states that are in the Confederacy, Lincoln says, because you are rebelling, I'm now proclaiming that all the slaves there are free. Now, of course, if you're a slave owner in South Carolina or Texas or Louisiana, you're not going to let your slaves free just because the president of the enemy nation says they're free. But what Lincoln does is get this ball rolling. The slaves hear about it. They're excited because if the Confederacy loses, they'll probably be free. And Lincoln says, if you can get free, come to the North and be part of our Union Army or our Union Navy. We need you. So this Emancipation Proclamation doesn't affect slavery in, say, Missouri, because Missouri's still in the Union. But those slave states that have rebelled, Lincoln is saying, I'm using my power during this war to release the slaves. Again, it's not really going to change much, but it changes everything, right? It begins the process. But in reality, a lot of slaves are still going to be slaves. No one's going to free the slaves in Georgia. They're not going to let them out just because Lincoln says to end slavery. They hate Lincoln. If they could get their hands on Lincoln, they would kill him. But they hear what he's doing, and it makes the South mad. It makes the slaves in those rebel states hopeful. And a little later on, Lincoln will move to wipe out slavery everywhere, but he has to change the Constitution. He has to amend the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, 1-3, no slavery. So Lincoln will do that later, but he begins with the Emancipation Proclamation. So just to be clear, it doesn't free slaves everywhere, only in those rebel states that are rebelling. And of course, those states aren't really going to listen to Lincoln, but it's a move towards ending slavery. Got it? Okay. Another thing that kids always ask about, why would our hockey team be called the Blue Jackets? Well, Ohio was super important in the Civil War. We gave more soldiers than any other state, and a lot of the big generals that helped win the war were from Ohio. In the upper right there, you'll see Grant, General Grant, who is going to be the big leader of the Union, who will help win the war and would later go on to be president. In the bottom left, you'll see General William Tecumseh Sherman, who's also going to help the Union defeat the Confederacy. So when we look at this Blue Jackets team, right, they all wear blue jackets, like soldiers from the Union, the hat, the cannon. It's just a way to honor those from Ohio who fought in the Civil War. So let's talk about General Grant for a moment. He becomes famous for what he does in the state of Mississippi. So out in Mississippi in the summer of 1863, now the Union is starting to win some battles. It's important that the Union gets control of the Mississippi River. So President Lincoln sends General Grant out west to Mississippi to try to get control of this river. Vicksburg, Mississippi is a key city. What Grant will do is he will take his army and he will surround the city and not let anything in or anything out. That's called a siege. The Confederates were cut off and bombed for months. They were forced to eat terrible things like dogs and horses, and there's no fresh water, and in the end they finally would surrender. The Union gets control of the Mississippi River, and now all the way from, say, Minnesota down to New Orleans, Louisiana, they control all the waterways. So it's devastating for the Confederacy and great for the Union. So this is in the summer of 1863. So literally in July of 1863, Vicksburg is surrendering. At the same time, another key important battle is happening in Pennsylvania. So Vicksburg is in Mississippi. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, the two burgs. So where the star is, you can see almost on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland is Gettysburg. And I can't remember if you guys went there on your 8th grade trip or not. But Gettysburg is the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought in North America. Over 3 days, July 1st through 3rd, at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a giant, huge fight between the Confederacy and the Union. And over those 3 days, probably around 55,000 Americans will die, either on the battlefield or days later from their wounds or an infection. But as a result of Gettysburg, 55 or so thousand Americans will die. So why was Gettysburg so big and important? The who, what, where, when, why, how of Gettysburg. Well, we know the who is the Union Army and the Confederate Army. It's in Pennsylvania. It's July 1863. And try to imagine that, those long sleeve wool uniforms, how hot it is, marching across fields and fighting. It would just be terrible. There are some theories, I guess, that the Confederates needed supplies. Remember, the Union had a lot of things. The Confederacy didn't have much, and they didn't have shoes. So they were looking for shoes, and there was a shoe factory around Gettysburg, and the Confederates were trying to march up there and ran into the Union Army. And this epic battle lasts 3 days. Robert E. Lee is the main general for the Confederates, and a guy named George Meade is the head general for the Union. A lot of people think it's Grant, but no, Grant isn't there, right? Grant is out in Vicksburg, Mississippi at this time. There are very few battles where Lee and Grant actually face each other. We'll talk about those a little later in the week. So the Battle of Gettysburg is a 3-day battle that is giant and epic. The Union will win, and this really is the turning point. From this point on, the Confederacy starts to fall apart, and within a year or so, they will have lost the war. So what I think we'll do now is pause, and you watch this again if you need to. Maybe I'll post a virtual battlefield tour of Gettysburg, and then we'll check in later in a day or two for some learning activities.